lecture theatre, and also to the nearly 100 participants who we had registered online to begin with, but that number may well have increased, so we are live streaming this event. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome all of you and to welcome the shadow Labour Party government group who are pushing forward on international development agendas. I'm actually going to hand over to Purna, who is the parliamentary candidate for Labour in our Brighton constituency, who is going to say something about their agenda and introduce our speaker for today, Mary Creagh.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. And a warm good morning still to you all. And many thanks to IDS actually for hosting us today and for being part of the conversations that the party wants to have as we move forward on the development agenda. It's a real pleasure to be in Pavilion in my constituency for this conversation and at IDS, and I look forward to seeing you again actually in a few weeks in February for the next session around the future of the UK and the global agenda. So 2015 is a massively great year, as you all know. It's a huge year. We have Beijing +20 coming up in 5 weeks' time. We've got the negotiations around the Sustainable Development Goals, and then we have Paris. Massive year, lots happening, a time when many key concerns of ours in development are at a juncture, and where the direction of travel, as well as the specifics, are all up for grabs. It's a time when we need to set a really clear direction. We need to be ready to hit the ground running in May, Mary. In May, of course, we will have passed Beijing +20, but those who will be there from the Labour Party will be making input, and I know some members of the Shadow Development team are going to be there. I'm going to be there with my work hat on, because I do teach gender and development, and I run a research project that's related. But in May, the SDG negotiations will probably still be going, because I'll no doubt go right to the wire, and there'll be still time to influence them. My interest in gender, and I know I share that with many at IDS, I would caution that no matter the noise that's been made by this government and others about a standalone gender goal, there's no guarantee at all that that's in the bag, and we still have to fight on that one, and we have to fight tenaciously. Staying with gender for a moment, the interest that's emerged over the last 10-15 years globally around violence against women in development, we have to be really mindful about how that's done, because there's a real tendency now to slip into the othering of what some people call exotic types of violence, of FGM, of forced marriage, of child marriage, but actually what we need to remember is the continuity across different forms of violence and the continuity in what we call developing countries and the West. And one of the things that has made the women's movement so strong in fighting these is its unanimity and its ability to work constructively across different locations. More generally, we know that in contrast to the MDGs, there's been much consultation and participation in shaping the discussion of the SDGs. And unfortunately, I'm no doubt that many will be disappointed that what they want won't appear. And we have to be ready to manage that expectation and still to make sure that people are engaged in the process as it goes forward. And investing in community organisations and in NGOs is absolutely critical to moving forward on these issues. And the massive challenges we face go way beyond gender, but take in inequality in so many dimensions, and I know inequality is a big interest at the IDS, and our lasting interest in sustainability, not just in the sunset levels, but also in the Maldives, in Tuvalu, in Bangladesh, and the profoundly unsettling aspects of growing inequality sharply focus our minds to the massive tasks in hand. And while Oxfam tells us that 1% of the world's population will be richer than all the rest by 2016, that's only next year, we know that inequality is poisonous and a social and economic drag, but intrinsically an ungood. Finally, because I'm going to hand over to Mary, I believe that our future, our common future, to steal a phrase, has to be about mutual respect and interdependence, about justice and equality. This year is a milestone, a real watershed in shaping that future. I'm afraid we did not make poverty history, and we did not make inequality history either. I want our future to be about dignity. Not only is poverty absolutely antithetical to that, but so are violence, unsustainability, and conflict. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Mary to you as our Shadow Secretary of State for International Development, She's going to talk a bit about our plans for the future as we move forward in development and sustainability. Mary has been the Member of Parliament for Wakefield since 2005 and Shadow Secretary of State for International Development since November last year. And Mary has previously held the post of Shadow Secretary of State for Transport and, importantly, for the Development Agenda, Shadow Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. I'd like also to acknowledge Anas Sawa somewhere in the room there. You are, Anas, as a member of the Shadow Development team too. I'd just like to finish my few words with a quote from what Mary said yesterday in the discussion, in the debate in Parliament around development. And she said, with the right leadership, ours is a generation that can end extreme poverty, reduce inequality and tackle climate change. We can move to a world beyond aid and enable people to secure justice instead of charity. Mary.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much indeed, Purna, for that very kind introduction. And as many of you know, Purna is standing to be the next MP for Brighton Pavilion, but she's also an expert in international development, Deputy Director at the Institute for Public Affairs at the LSE, and she's worked on human rights for the Commonwealth Secretariat and at Amnesty International. So I certainly hope you get the chance to serve this constituency. Thank you to Melissa for your very kind invitation to address you today. It's been a while since I stood in a lecture theatre. I used to teach at Cranfield School of Management, a very similar institute to this in that people came from all over the world to get their MBAs and set up small businesses. So it was very much an institution that was focused on teaching and learning, but also making sure that we put what we learn in the classroom out to good use out in the communities and the businesses, in that case, that we run. You are world leaders in your field, and it's a real honour for me to be here with you today. You play a crucial part in training the next generation of development professionals. So it's absolutely vital that we listen to what you're saying, and I hope we'll be able to carry on a very productive dialogue going forward. 2 weeks ago, at the start of Action 2015, Ed Miliband reaffirmed the Labour Party's commitment to global justice and solidarity, and I'm delighted to see that we have some youth ambassadors here from that campaign and colleagues from across the sector who travelled here today and bumped into each other on the train, which is always nice, and the train was on time, which is always even more exciting. It would be easy in the current climate of political frustration, people are fed up with politics, to turn away from addressing the world's most intractable problems. Some parties say now is not the time for renewed global ambition, especially on international development. I disagree. Social justice and human rights are fundamental to Labour's values, and our values do not stop at the White Cliffs of Dover. And as Ed said in that speech, business as usual is not acceptable. The world today is globalised and connected as never before. Climate change, economic crises and disease outbreaks are everyone's concern. Our commitment to the world's poorest and most vulnerable is not just morally right, it's also in Britain's national interest. And I want to talk about the once-in-a-generation opportunity that 2015, the European Year of Development, gives us. In September in New York, the UN will agree the replacement to the Millennium Development Goals. And in December in Paris, we will agree a framework to tackle climate change. Both would be priorities for a Labour government. Let me talk about inequality. And I was just sitting listening to Purna, I was thinking about inequality, and a thought popped into my head as a politician who sometimes notionally has power. And I thought that actually inequality always stems from an imbalance of power. And as a politician, I ask myself, how do I exercise power? On whose behalf do I exercise it? And how can they sack me? And they can sack me if they want, on May the 7th, fingers crossed they won't. But imbalance of power is actually the driver behind inequality. So I think when we talk about inequality, we actually need to be thinking about power. Power at every level, not just the power between politicians and the communities they represent, but power within families, within communities, within regions, within countries. Inequality matters. It reduces growth and it hinders development. Health, Education, work and participation in civil society, each are basic human rights, but they're increasingly determined by where you are born. Nearly half of the world's wealth belongs to just 1% of the population. But as I said, inequality is about more than money. Gender, caste, race, community, disability, religion, ethnicity, far too often this is what determines your life chances. And if more is not done to protect the most vulnerable people and to give them power, countries can never fully develop. It's for this reason that I'm determined that the SDGs should do more to tackle inequalities in 3 areas that matter deeply to the Labour Party: human rights, climate change and universal health coverage. Areas that this government barely discuss at all, either at home or abroad. Let me start with human rights. Basic human rights are integral to what it means to be free. And when I came into Parliament, I decided that I would focus my attentions as a backbencher on genocide prevention. And I was the chair of the Genocide Prevention Group and the Great Lakes Group. And I visited Rwanda, DRC and Burundi to look at what happens in post-conflict societies. Women and girls must be free from the fear of violence, coercion or intimidation, and be free to choose how many children they have. We want girls to have the same chances as boys, to enjoy their education, free from the threat of forced or child marriage. I want to see DFID spearheading more approaches that change the value of education, such as the successful cash transfer projects. We want to tackle the economic conditions and supply chains that tolerate the obscenity of 168 million child workers. And don't think that that's going to be easy. I represent a mining region, Wakefield, in the north of England. That's near Leeds, for those of you who are British. And for those of you who are British, it's near Leeds. We have a national coal mining museum. And it's a former pit. And they have fantastic photos. And I like to take my children around there. Because, you know, like all modern children, they like to complain. We all like to complain. And there are photos and documentation from that pit from the 1870s discussing how the 5-year-olds would be pushing the coal trolleys underground for 12 hours a day. The mine owners liked children to work in the mines because if there was an explosion, they didn't have to pay full compensation to their parents. You only paid for a man or a woman, probably less for a woman. I didn't really look into that. So if you had a child working, and these children were doing the work that was later done by the pit ponies. We have a huge amount of compassion for animals in this country, and people, you know, I know from my DEFRA days talking about animals, we sent children down the mines to push coal trolleys in the dark for 12 hours a day, 150 years ago, in this country. And when we decided that we were going to put children in school, and we were going to take them out of the mills, we're going to take them out of the mines, people complained. And it's not going to be easy to take them out of the supply chains that provide us with cheap fashion, cheap food. This is going to be hard. But there are companies out there that want to work and want to do that. We have to make sure that there is an environment where the supply chain is clean. And we'll be saying more about that in Cambridge in March. There is no better route out of poverty than a job. Workers must have access to decent work, decent pay and rest breaks, and the freedom to join a trade union. We must not have a repeat of the terrible Rana Plaza disaster. So a Labour government will reverse this government's ideological decision to stop funding the International Labour Organisation. And the private sector needs to play its role. Labour will support good companies that pay their fair share of tax, maintain a clean supply chain and pay a fair wage. We also want children affected by conflict to have access to the psychosocial services they need and the right to go to school. And we want LGBT communities to be free to love and marry whom they wish, the disabled to participate fully in society, and protection for Indigenous peoples. Let's look at climate change. We know the effects of climate change will hit the poorest hardest, and eradicating poverty will only be possible if we tackle climate change. We know if we do not cap temperature rises to below 2 degrees, then millions will fall back into poverty. The Prime Minister says very little about his wind turbine these days. He is a prisoner of a divided party, split over whether climate change even exists. For Labour, climate change will be at the centre of our foreign policy and integral to our plan to change Britain. And this year we have a fantastic opportunity with Paris. The United States, the EU and crucially China are all showing a willingness to act. A Labour government would push for global targets to reduce carbon emissions with regular reviews towards the long-term goal of what the science now tells us is necessary, which is 0 net global emissions in the latter half of this century. And let's look at health. Healthcare, being alive, a healthy life, is the bedrock of development. Labour is the party of the NHS, and we want others to enjoy the protections that we here take for granted. Ensuring everyone in the world has access to affordable healthcare is essential to end poverty, because it is deeply unfair that 3 million people die every year from preventable illness. Because last year there were 1.5 million AIDS-related deaths, when we have treatments that could have kept those people alive. 3/4 of those living in low-income countries lack access to decent healthcare. It's about power, how you exercise it, and in whose interests. This government doesn't understand why it matters. They will not support a standalone goal on universal health coverage in the Sustainable Development Goals. Figures from the House of Commons Library show this government cut bilateral spending on health in Sierra Leone and Liberia from £26 million in 2010 to £16 million this year. And when we were in Geneva last week talking to the Global Fund, World Health Organization, charities out there, we also heard some of the difficulties of healthcare workers not being paid in those Ebola-affected countries as well. So the systems simply aren't in place. I support the help that DFID has given to the Ebola crisis, £320 million. But the best way to protect against disease is to build a resilient, government-controlled, government-funded health service. The World Health Organization has calculated that universal health coverage would stop 100 million people a year from falling into poverty. There is no simple, measurable solution that I know of to help those countries that want it to set up a health service. Lasting healthcare systems are about more than the delivery of commodities like vaccines and bed nets, vital though those things are. We have seen the devastation that a failure to strengthen post-conflict health systems has led to in West Africa. With no treatment and no vaccines, we've had no option but to watch health systems in Sierra Leone, Liberia and Guinea all but collapse. And there is good news. That it seems that the outbreak is now under control. I was listening to the World Service last night. I was working late on this speech. I went to bed really late. And what people were talking about is how is the epidemic being brought under control? It's been brought under control by very simple things: hygiene techniques, safe burial practices, and making sure that communities understand how to protect themselves from the risks. And those interventions are delivered best by people on the ground, trusted in their community, to come in and tell people how to protect themselves. So it's happened from systemic change, which is very interesting. The World Health Organization, the World Bank and countries like France and Japan are all clear that universal health coverage is the right direction for the world to move in. Britain needs to catch up. I want DFID to lead the pack, not follow it. So today I want to set out 2 things that Labour will do in government to increase universal health coverage. Pens at the ready. It's the important bit. First, Labour will establish a Centre for Universal Health Coverage. This will provide global partnerships, support and encouragement to countries that want to move to universal health care. Labour learnt a lot when we set up the National Health Service. Everyone in this room is probably a bit young to be watching Call the Midwife. Sunday nights, 8 o'clock, hands up who watches Call the Midwife. Yeah, it's great. It's all the women. We're like a bit of cry on a Sunday night before we go to work on Monday. But we can see what universal health coverage looks like every day, and I read the book as well, the book is excellent. Prenatal care, orange juice and rosehip syrup for expectant mums, every birth attended by a skilled midwife. Milk tokens for the children in last week's episode, and parenting classes to discuss the benefits of breastfeeding, over-formula feeding and sterilisation issues. But crucially, prostitutes, immigrants and the middle classes all treated with care, dignity and respect. Nobody excluded from that healthcare system because of their status. It is a long and difficult journey. It requires vision and courage. It needs bold political commitment and long-term funding, trained health workers, functioning public finance systems and much more. None of this is easy, but a Centre for Universal Health Coverage would recognise that building a robust and equitable health system is ultimately a political decision. We would work with enlightened political leaders in developing countries, and we would work to help them generate adequate funding from their own as well as external sources. And we'd help them set up the systems they need to deliver healthcare, especially in rural areas. And we know that people in those rural areas, those areas that don't have roads, don't have communications, they are always the hardest to reach. They're the hardest to reach in the UK. The Scilly Isles, the Highlands and Islands, it's challenging. The second thing I want to announce today is I want DFID to play a role in trying to reshape the global health system. It's under immense strain and it needs reform. The last Labour government helped found the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB and malaria, the three great epidemics of our age. In 2002, just 700,000 people were getting access to ARV treatment, and they were mostly in Western countries. Because of that fund, today, 13 million people access life-saving HIV treatment. We also helped set up Gavi to provide vaccines to halve the number of children who die before their 5th birthday. So that's dropped from 12 million to 6 million children. To reach those Millennium Development Goals, we knew we needed new ways of working together and new ways of doing things. So for me, the SDGs are a chance to pause and reflect on the achievements, but also to look now at the step change we need to complete those Millennium Development Goals and reach the Sustainable Development Goals. The World Health Organization will struggle to reform itself without strong leadership. And we have too many organisations that are focused on specific diseases and too few that are focused on strengthening health systems. And the rate of tackling TB in particular is too slow and must be addressed. I want DFID to bring cohesion across the myriad organisations and to encourage them to work directly with governments to establish durable, country-directed solutions. There is global will at the macro level, the United Nations, and there's huge political commitment at the micro level of development organisations and professionals working on the ground. But what I want to try and develop is the meso level, the intermediate stage between giant global organisations and the mother in DRC or South Sudan who turns up to a clinic to find no vaccines and no healthcare workers. The meso level is where countries are enabled to take ownership of their own development and health and can fund it and deliver it themselves. Labour will provide global leadership to bring some clarity and coordination that puts the needs of partner countries first. So let me conclude by saying I don't have all the answers. But we in the Labour Party have values and ideas and political will and a desire to change the world, as you do, and leave it better than we found it. You share that hope and vision for a better world, and that is what you are all here to do. 2015 is a unique opportunity for the world to think bigger and do better for ourselves, our children, and the world's poorest people. That is a thrilling opportunity. We must not let them down. Thank you.
Mary, thank you so much. That was wonderful. And sitting here, I'm just struck by the sense of vision, but also by the alignment with many of the things that we think about at IDS. A focus on inequalities, a recognition of global interconnections, that development is progressive change for everybody everywhere. I love the allusion to what is going on in the UK and has gone in the past. The focus on health, which is a big one for us, and health systems, really building those state and meso-level capacities. And ultimately, the phrase that it's all about power. Power analysis being something that has infused pretty much everything that IDS has ever done, and the way we continue to think and act around these challenges. So that was enormously enlightening and very, very exciting. So in the time we've got, I'm going to open up for discussion. I'm sure people have questions, comments. We're going to take them in small groups of 3. If you could just quickly say who you are, and then Mary will respond, and we'll carry on until 12:30, so that gives a bit of time for discussion. So who'd like to start? I'm afraid we don't have a roving mic, so I would ask you please to shout. So, yes?
Hi, Leila Zada from the International HIV/AIDS Alliance. Thank you so much for the opportunity today to ask you these questions, and it's really good to hear about your support for UHC and health system strengthening and the HIV response. Just specifically on UHC, would a Labour government make sure that HIV is included within the services covered?
That's a good one. Yeah, look at the top there.
I'm Rachel Godfrey from Institute of Development Studies. We talked about kind of inequality and imbalances of power, and it was heartening to hear you talk about issues of in whose interest you're exercising power, how do people get privilege, which was quite similar to what, of course, the late Tony Benn used to say about power. But what Tony Benn understood was it's not enough just to criticise these things, you have to attack the interesting paradigms that generate these inequalities, right? And what we have seen in Europe is the generation of new inequalities through the use of debt by the ruling classes within Europe to force austerity programs on the southern European countries. So now that there is a progressive government elected in Greece, will the Labour Party make a firm stand supporting the legitimate demand to restructure Europe's debt?
Okay, that's a good one. Anthony at the front.
I am Agnes Campbell. I'm at the university here studying in sociology department, and I'm a researcher interested in violence against women as it intersects with HIV and AIDS. I see the connection because findings from the field show that it's quite interrelated. You have to address inequalities in terms of gender, in terms of stigmatization. So priority must really be placed in helping organizations which are on the ground trying to negotiate to help governments to be accountable, because some of the challenges that are faced is not just at the micro level, but it involves macro systems. For example, I come from a country where the president is claiming there is treatment for HIV and AIDS. And so there are conflicting information going on. Who do you go to in terms of access of service? So there's an interconnectedness between all this, and there must be priority for funding and capacity building for people who work in these areas.
Yeah, sure. Well, perhaps I can start with Greece and its debt. I mean, I think that's an issue for the Greek government to sort out. There is no doubt that Greece has had a huge recession. Its economy shrunk by 25%. It has 25% unemployment, and they have had a terrible crisis in their economy. But I think I'm going to leave it to the Greek government to negotiate what its debt is going to be and how that's going to look. And it's very, very early days. That's what I would say. But I think it's important to remember what the purpose of the European Union is. And what it is the most successful peace process that there's ever been, in terms of providing a system by which post-conflict countries, and let's not forget, London was flat when we set up the NHS service. There weren't many buildings left, and I'm from Coventry, and there weren't many buildings left in Coventry either. So the point of the EU is to provide a route out of conflict, out of dictatorship, and for countries to hope for a better future. And I think one of the things that we've seen in Greece is that, you know, maybe the promises of a better future have not been fulfilled in that context, but their decision on their debt is a decision for them. Agnes, you talked about organisations on the ground. I completely agree. I think one of the big problems, I worked in the European Union for a while, is you pour money in at the top and you get told it's all happening on the ground, and then someone goes into a clinic and says, actually, there's nobody here, no one's been paid, someone's stolen this and sold it on the black market. So it's really important that civil society is empowered to play its part, and I think this is particularly important post-conflict. Because having a strong civil society is one of the guarantors that the state then does not slip back into conflict. I also think that it's hard for DFID to do that because there's a big budget and it's growing, and so I've met with groups from South Africa and Ethiopia saying, well, you know, we only need sort of £100,000. That's actually quite hard for a big organisation like DFID to manage. So I'm thinking, and I want to talk with the civil servants about how we can support civil society in those countries for the outcomes that we want. And those aren't the outcomes that are easily measurable. It's about creating civic space, civic dialogue, and that is hard. And you can't just say, well, but what you can say is we found out that the whatever it was, medicines money was being stolen. That's priceless, you know. So if that's, I think there's a definite need for that. Layla, HIV/AIDS. I'm coming to meet you later on, I think. So we can perhaps reserve our deep discussion on that. But certainly, if you have, we have AIDS, TB, and malaria as specific issues. They are funded. The problem is, at the moment, if you turn up to a malaria clinic and you have yellow fever, there's nothing for you. So I turn my question back on you and say, you know, what do we do to make sure that all fevers are treated in a malaria clinic? Or what do we do to make sure TB is treated alongside HIV? And the TB issue is the big issue because the amount of money we're putting in, I think it's $6 billion globally, and we're getting a 1.5% reduction in the TB load. And obviously, you know that TB is a sort of comorbidity, there's a comorbidity with HIV. That is not reducing fast enough. And we have to do something about that. So we need to look very carefully. But obviously, access to HIV medicines is paramount because treatment is prevention. And I was talking to Michael Sidibe from UNAIDS last week, and his 90% of people know their status, 90% in treatment, 90% have an undetectable viral load, is the next big push going forward.
Can I just add something on the violence question?
Sure.
Agnes, I just want to pick up what you were saying about enabling community groups to hold their governments to account, and it links to what Mary was saying before around human rights. And I think there's a whole area there that we could pursue much more fully. Certainly there's the funding issue for community groups, but also accountability systems that exist, and we need to use them much better. In South Africa, for example, they've been much better, the women's organisations have been much better at holding their governments to account in international commitments around women's rights and violence than we have elsewhere. In fact, I was involved in doing the first report from the UK Women's Movement on Violence to the UN to hold our government, which was our government, Labour Party government, to account on these issues. And I think if we could build that much more effectively into our development programme, we'd be making also a helpful contribution in strengthening those systems and the ability of community groups in women's areas and also others to use them effectively.
I just want to come back on your point about violence. I forgot to say, we learnt last week, and maybe everyone in this room knows this, so stop me if you've heard it before, but HIV prevention in South Africa, the cash transfers of about $60 a year to stop young girls falling into the hands of sugar daddies and becoming HIV infected. Giving girls a bus fare to get to school can stop them contracting HIV. It's better to invest upstream than to invest downstream, surely.
Excellent. Right, let's move on. Alex, I've got a lot of questions now. If people can be reasonably short, we'll get through more.
As Alex Shanker, the work in Institute of Studies, among other things on the programme we have on Rising Powers and International Development, including in relation to health systems. So I wanted to welcome the announcement of the Centre for Diverse Health Coverage. I think it's a very exciting initiative, but to ask first in general about how you would see DFID engaging with the rising powers of BRICS and other globally influential middle-income countries in 2015 and beyond, and specifically in relation to health and the centre, whether you see a role for what we call mutual learning at IDS and the role of learning, for example, countries like Brazil being very successful in achieving universal health coverage in situations of high inequality and resource constraint, and even actually picking up a tip or two for the UK, where actually they're ahead of us on things like patient-public involvement. So do you see a role for it in a two-way process, or more about the UK pushing expertise out into our systems in developing countries?
Excellent.
Roger Williamson, United Nations University in IDS. I very much welcome the commitment on the ILO. I think that's a very positive step. Could you say a bit more about jobs and inclusive growth? Because Gordon Brown was right about that, that jobs are the way out of poverty.
Campaign friendly.
Hello, my name is Billy Hill from the One Campaign. It's so great to hear both you and Purna speak so passionately about international development as well, and it's great to see Gavin and Anas here as well from the Shadow DFID team. Mary Creagh wrote a great article in the Telegraph recently, talking about the UK and sort of the pride in international development. But she spoke a lot about sort of parliamentarians not necessarily being open on their support for international development. She spoke about what should be a cause for national celebration has become a grubby secret. So we're going to be campaigning around the election. We've only got a couple of months to go, in just under 100 days. So we're going to campaign a lot. What can we do as campaigners to make sure that MPs, to make sure that politicians are talking passionately about international development and then making solid commitments about it as well?
Okay. Really diverse areas.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's 98 days to go to the general election. I'm sure I'm going to be, clicking it off in my Rolodex in my head from now until then. I think I throw the question back to you, Billy. I mean, we have a huge interconnected world, and we have a very diverse country with lots of diversity in our cities, in our universities. And I think mobilising that kind of the tacit support of the silent majority is what we need to be talking about. And I think the Ebola outbreak has shown us just how easy it is for disease to spread, for indifference, seeing and complacency to lead to pretty catastrophic reverses in development. We're going to need an Ebola reconstruction action plan. Because it's like they've had another war now, because there's so many people that have died and the economic activity has stopped, the health systems work, the immunisations, all of that has been put on hold for the best part of a year. So we need to be, and I think actually if you go out door knocking and ask people don't want to think of children dying on their first and only day of life. They don't want to think of mothers unable to give birth because of lack of a trained midwife. People do feel these things very deeply, and the British public is incredibly generous. So I think we had a debate on it yesterday. You can read that all in Hansard. But I think it's something that we do need to get out, and as a Labour politician, I'm very proud of the work that we did. On work, I mean, perhaps Purna wants to say something on that, but it's clear that it is tricky. I visited Rumbek in South Sudan and a DFID-funded project in 2012. And I was saying to Melissa on the way in, I wonder if it's still there. I've got the video on my phone, but I wonder if those children and those women are still alive and what happened to those plants. And incredibly fertile country, conflict, DFID-funded project, food security. But they had to walk about 6 hours to get to market. And then they had to walk 6 hours back. So you think of the calorific output to sell your thing. And who's looking after your kids when you're away? All of these are really sort of basic problems. We scoot around on the tube and the buses and the bikes, and it's all happy days. And if we don't have roads and transports, you don't have markets, and if you don't have markets, it's very hard to have employment. And coming from the transport brief, this is something I reflected on a lot. So access to markets, good cities, which is one of the sustainable development goals as well, because actually, if you're a subsistence farmer, you're only one bad harvest away from starvation. And we do need to make sure that those women, they are predominantly women, have a support net in place, but we also need to make sure that they have the skills to be able to sell and to work and to support their families. So we are very clear that on the supply chain issues, it is an issue that affects UK and global companies, particularly on food, particularly on fashion, and particularly financially. We want them to pay their taxes, we want them to be socially responsible, and we want them to look after the people and look after the environment. We don't want to see the rainforest being cut down to grow coffee so that we can all have a nice cup of coffee. That's the ultimate unsustainable product. And I think, as I said, I'd be setting out in Cambridge our work on the company, and Anas is leading that for us. Gavin is leading our work on sustainable development goals. But you're right, work is the best route out of poverty, and it also gives you protection. Being part of a workplace or being part of a community where work is happening immediately means that you are connected to other people in society and increases your power networks, which is, I think, a really important insurance. And just, Alex, your thing on learning from other countries, certainly Brazil has done fantastic work, and I think the danger that we have is to think, well, we know it all here and we've got nothing to learn from anybody else. And I was very interested in the fact that you setting, learning partnerships. And I'd be very interested on your reflections and input on how we design this thing, because the civil servants will come up with something for us and we have our own ideas, but I want to hear your ideas as well on that.
And so thanks, Mary. And Billy, I think you're right in some ways. It is talked about as a dirty secret. And I think there are reasons for that. In some ways, it's easier to slip below the radar and carry on with the 0.7% and not have a fuss made about it. Because if you came out with me on the doorstep, you'd find not only people who don't want kids to die on the first day, but who also don't want our money going over there when we've got troubles here. So there is a really difficult conversation to have, and you're very welcome to come out with me and hear what people have to say. But I'm happy to talk to you about what more we can do here, because it is something we should be proud of, and it is something we should go forward with great energy and commitment.
So I've got a host of hands. We're in the middle here.
Alison from the Cheshire Disability. DFID has just published the disability framework, and I would like to know what are Labour plans in terms of how DFID would tackle and how we would integrate disability in all of its work.
Robert Chambers, IDS. It was music to my ears to hear you talking about £100,000 to an NGO in South Africa, because things have got worse and worse with DFID in terms of not being able to make small grants. And I wonder if this is something that you can address when you become Secretary of State. When Andrew Mitchell was a shadow in waiting, he was twice here, he was twice asked about the increase in the budget without increasing the staff, and indeed with the staff becoming more managerial and less oriented towards development. And on both occasions he said it was ridiculous. But under the present government things have got worse. Not only have they got worse, but the internal procedures within DFID have tied it in knots so that it's as much work to make a 500,000 grant as it is to make a 50 million one. And so the whole incentive system is wrong. The whole system of business cases is having a terrible effect, and is also meaning with all these rules and regulations, they feed down to us in research, they feed down to NGOs. They are actually reducing, in my view, I may be wrong, but in my view they are reducing the effectiveness of our aid. And there are even people who are saying, unless DFID can reform itself, the 0.7 was a mistake. Now, as and when, as I hope, you become Secretary of State, will you please do something about this?
It's on camera as well. It wasn't on camera.
I'm going to go right to the top here. Gentleman at the back. Yeah.
Thank you. If it does anything after Robert Chambers, but we talk about climate change and LGBT rights and genocide. But I wonder what's the understanding of the party with regards to those people, as in asylum seekers and climate refugees who come to the UK or who want to come to the UK, but not within what from the perspective of a British person, but within the development view in discussion.
Purna's going to answer on the Cheshire.
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised that. I think internationally it's been a massive problem in the parallel track that's been dealt with, that's been trod around disability and one around development. And then a separate one on climate change, we can do that another time. But I think, with the CRPD in place and having one of the fastest sets of ratification of all treaties, and I've worked on this when I was at Commonwealth. We did a lot of work with 54 states to get them to take this seriously, and with the committee monitoring the CRPD. I think we need to feed the CRPD commitments and our human rights commitments into the whole of development work. We know how astoundingly, shockingly people with disabilities are treated, blocked in houses, kept away from their families, starved, and that really has to feed into the fundamental core development conversation and work that we're doing. And I hope, Mary, that's something we may be able to talk about a little more.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's also, let's not forget how people with disabilities were treated 30 years ago in this country. And there are still issues. I think we have to have a certain amount of humility about the change that we have made, but also the problems that still exist. And if these issues were easy, then they would have been sorted a long time ago. These require cultural change, and I think that cultural and social change does take time, but it's really, really important. And it comes from education as well. Education is really important. Robert, you talked about Andrew Mitchell. He was in the debate yesterday. And I suppose what I would say is there's a philosophical question about whether DFID is a wholesaler or a retailer of aid. I think that's important. It's something I'm reflecting on. They've reduced the number of countries that we're operating in, 43 down to 28. And there's a big play about pulling out of India and maybe South Africa, etc. But these particularly India and actually Nigeria, middle-income countries are the ones with the worst maternal and child health statistics. So if you want to sort of be where the poor are, how do you help them? That comes back to Alex's question as well. I think it's unfortunate that there's been a reduction in DFID staff and that knowledge and learning that existed within DFID. And I think we need to look at how we support particularly civil society, but researchers like yourself in how we free up the processes. Justine Greening has a £5 million threshold and she signs everything off, and I'm hearing that creates a blockage. But it's also, there's the Public Accounts Committee report today about the PIDG. So as the budget grows, the ideology is to give that money to PIDG, and there's a lot of talk about their board members and their governance. I'm not sure who's on their board. I mean, the website's quite thin. And there's now been criticism from the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee about how you follow that money as it goes off into funds, matched with other funds, leveraging things in. And if you don't know where it's going, how do you know if it's helping the poorest? So for me, that's an area of concern. And I think we need to absolutely account for taxpayers' money, because if we don't, and we have reports like that coming out, it undermines what Billy's trying to do and what we're all trying to do, which is get permission to have this transfer, this 0.7% from the UK to other countries and the people that need it. And on 0.7, there was a lot of rhetoric yesterday about, Labour had 13 years in government, why didn't you do it? Well, the reason we didn't do it was because in 1997, GNI spending on development was 0.21%. And it would have been absurd to come in 1997 and say, we're going to treble aid spending overnight, because that is a surefire, guaranteed way of wasting money. So we did it gradually, we reformed DFID, we took out all the things that had been classed as aid, some of the defence spending. So I'm concerned that some of that defence and foreign office spending may now be creeping back in and in the accounting for aid. So we are, as I said, I've only been in post 12 weeks, but we have a series of questions down on that. I haven't had questions on the PIDG and the private sector. I haven't had answers to those questions. I'm going to see if I can get a bit further on where the money is being spent. On the asylum seekers question and climate change, there's a very difficult debate going on at the moment in our country about asylum seekers is almost treated as a dirty word, and we have a number of asylum seekers in Wakefield. They came through UN programmes. They fled Kosovo, and we have Ethiopian, people from all corners of the earth. And I suppose, I think the great challenge for our generation is going to be the crisis in Syria. 4.5 million displaced people, and the UNHCR is now saying that 450,000 of them will need permanent resettlement. And so far, we have refused to take part in the UN scheme, and we have had this exceptional scheme under which only 90 people have come to this country. You know, and it's like, well, what happened to the 91st person? You know, or the 92nd? Were they not? And it's not clear to me how. We've asked a few questions. I asked a question of DFID. I said, oh, what contact have you had with the UNHCR and the Home Office about this scheme? And they said, none. Like, oh, DFID's out there doing humanitarian assistance, but we're not involved in the process of helping refugees who want to apply for this who want to apply for asylum in this country. It sort of seems absurd in terms of joined up government, doesn't it?
You all have to go at 12:30, is that right? So, you know, I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to draw it to a close there. It's been really a fantastic set of comments and questions. We can continue the debate online. If people want to write blogs, send them to us at IDS, and we can think about publishing them. But I would also encourage you through social media to tweet some comments, get some debate going around the things we've heard today. What's our hashtag? Can you tweet the IDS?
If you just use the IDS Twitter handle at IDS_UK.
Yeah, okay, that would work well. But it's really down to me to say an enormous thank you. I mean, I think you will have heard from the comments the sense of alignment with a lot of the thinking here. We've been talking about joined up government in a joined up world. We've been talking about mutual learning and partnerships, things the UK can learn from things happening elsewhere, as well as the other way around. The strong impetus around precisely the challenges that I think we're all prioritising. It's rights, it's jobs, it's climate change, it's sustainability, it's inequality. And that key message about power, which I think runs through not just formal politics, which is the world we're in now over the next couple of months, but those more informal politics, through civil society, through the way that knowledge and ideas are constructed that feed back into development agendas. So I think we'll all be watching the next couple of months and May and beyond very, very hopefully. And would like to thank you all as you now go forth into Brighton to try and weave those narratives that connect the local with the global grid as well. So thank you.